Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are once again going to be returning to our highly popular educational speedrun series. Now, we have crossed the 1200 rating mark. At this point, I expect more games to reach the middle games, more themes to exist beyond just the opening phase, but let's jump right into the action and see how things go, and we'll start with a 10-minute rapid game.
Zooming through the game with a bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Night on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey, hey, he's smurfing play by play, beat you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat, just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
Let's hit the start game button and off we go. We're playing the first game with the black pieces. So it would appear that my opponent is a little bit slow. We get d4 and now I play the move knight to f6. I was not sure if my opponent was going to start out or actually abandon the game. We get the move bishop to g5. Now this is what is known as the Trompowsky. This is an opening that I played a lot when I was about 10 to 11 years old. I think at the beginner level or even the intermediate level, very reasonable approach. Now there are many different setups for black. The one that I'm going to go for is objectively the most solid, both I would say at the beginner level, but even at the intermediate and advanced level, which is to play the move d5. Now my opponent plays knight d2. My opponent could have traded on f6. I will get to that once we do our post-game analysis, but here we got the move knight d2. Now what I'm going to play in this position is I'm going to play this move bishop to f5, and the idea here is to play e6 and play this a lot like a London system where I develop the bishop and the king. So let's go e6 here, consolidating the pawn structure, intending to develop the bishop. And now we get the move e3. Now here I have the choice of putting the bishop on either the d6 square or the e7 square. In this case, I'm going to put the bishop on e7, and it's primarily because with the bishop here pinning the knight, if I put the bishop on d6, I'm a little bit worried about something happening with this pin. When I go bishop to e7, the pin isn't a threat here. I can always move the knight without hanging my queen, and now I will finish the development by castling the king. So now we get the move knight to f3 being played. Now after knight to f3, I'm simply going to castle my king here, finishing the kingside development. As I've said in many of the previous videos, this is probably primarily the thing that you should focus on first and foremost at the beginner level, is finishing your kingside development. Now my opponent actually plays move knight h4. It's something that I kind of missed. I probably should have gone h6 first and then castled, so I would have a standard retreat with the bishop a la the London defense or London system. I will get to that, of course, and show that as well in our analysis afterwards. But here I don't really have that option to retreat the bishop as the knight attacks the bishop on f5. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play this move. I'm going to play the move bishop to g6 here. My opponent probably will trade. I'll take back with the h pawn. I could take with the f pawn, but generally when you got double pawns, you want to capture towards the center of the board. Of course, the e and the d files are the center, very specifically these two files. So generally when you get double pawns, you want to capture towards the center versus away from the center towards the edge of the board. So we get bishop e2. I'm going to play knight to d7 here, preparing to play the move pawn to c5. The knight and the bishop both guard the square, and once I go c5, I'm going to look to open up the center. I also perhaps can also go e5 here. I think I'm going to go c5. Why not? I have e5 potentially as well to really create a lot of pressure on this d4 pawn, but let's see how the game progresses. Now opponent takes, I'll take back with the pawn, capturing towards the center. If I take with the f pawn, this would be capturing towards the edge or the h file specifically. Of course, the h and the a files are what we call the edge of the board. Now my opponent plays h4. Now this is a very aggressive move and actually probably a good move here. I need to be very careful because since I have these double pawns here, this h file can open up very quickly where white can attack because white has not castled the king. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play the move knight to e4. I'm aiming to trade off some pieces here because if there are less pieces, if white pushes this pawn forward, pushing the p, I hope to close this file and not let the rook become super active. We trade. I'll take the bishop, of course. Otherwise, there's a free pawn as well, potentially. Now we get the trade. Now what I was starting to explain is that when white plays h5 here, I can simply push the pawn up to keep this file completely closed. After h5, if I take, the rook becomes very, very active here. But with just the lone rook here, now that I've relieved a lot of the pressure by forcing the trade of the knights and the bishops here, this idea of h5 is not really a big threat. Now we get d5. Excellent move for my opponent here as well, or actually maybe not quite. because what this move does do here is, if you look at this position, my knight does not have access to squares, whereas after d5 now the knight can jump to e5 as the square is no longer covered by the pawn. So I'm going to just jump right in here with the knight, spying both of these squares with the pawn supporting the horse. And black actually maybe is already a little bit better here in this situation, because I can also bring a rook to the center. And my opponent, by pushing h4, the assumption is my opponent wants to castle the king to the queen side here, doesn't want to castle the king side since you push these pawns up a little bit. So by playing d5, if my opponent can't castle to the queen side, now there are going to be problems here because of the weaknesses. When the king castles to the king side, we get f4. Of course, I go en passant, I take the pawn, we get takes, and now we'll play rook to d8, pressuring this pawn in the center of the board here. And white is actually in a lot of trouble at this point. Now we get the move e4. I think I can just take the pawn, because after pawn takes, I take the bishop with a double check, and this should be very, very good for me. We'll see what my opponent does, but already this has gone badly astray. I take, and now it's a classic double check here on the king, so white cannot take the knight due to the other check. The king is going to move. I'm going to drop the juicer back to e5, and already here I simply have an extra pony on the board. We both have a queen and 2 rooks, but my opponent here was never able to finish their development. The rooks and the queen never got into the game. The king had to move to f2, so now I'm left with the extra horse, and I'm going to win this game in very, very short order. So we get rook to e1, pressuring the pony. I'm just going to sidestep by going check. Now there's no pin on the file. King will probably slide to g2. I'll bring the rook to e8 here to overprotect the knight, and everything is looking very, very Gucci. I have this extra knight. I can maybe move the knight. I think here what I'm aiming for, I'm going to go for something really fancy. I'm going to play knight c4 here. I'm aiming for the classic family fork, forking the king, the rook, and the queen at the same time here. It is a temporary Botez gambit, but after rook takes queen, I go knight e3, and then I recapture the queen. So effectively, it's going to be an even trade where I force both the queens off the board, meaning that we're headed to an end game where I once again will simply have the extra pony. So I check, I take the queen. My opponent can't really take the horse because then I capture the rook. So the rook should probably go here. Rook should move back to some square. Let's see which square it goes to. So we get the move rook to f3. Now I'm simply going to gobble this pawn. My rook guards the knight here, so it can't be recaptured. And as you'll notice, both sides here, actually I guess white has only 5 pawns, but I have 6 pawns here. White has 5 pawns, but much more importantly, we both have 2 rooks, but I still keep this extra horse on the board. I'll just gobble, check, drop the rook back to guard the knight. Rook goes back to guard. Now I go knight to e3, and this knight has done a lot of work here. I fork the queen and the king, fork the king and the rook. Now I simply have 1 extra rook. We're going to go all in with rook to e2 here. I think I'll just drop it as a pre-move. My opponent chooses to resign. Had my opponent played the move rook takes f1, I would go rook to e2, followed by this move rook to d2, and with this double stack on the 7th rank here, this is a very, very easy, straightforward win. Now let's get back to our analysis. I think a lot of people really enjoy this because a lot of what I explain, I give some very sort of basic explanation, and then it's very hard to catch what I'm saying. So we've started incorporating this into our speedrun videos. We get this Trompowsky here with d4 and bishop g5, also colloquially known as the Trompowsky. I played d5 here. Now the reason that I say this is the most solid approach is that when you go d5 here, white doesn't really have ways to attack in the center. Now if you play a move like knight to e4, white can move the bishop and play f3 e4. White can also play h4, and there's some wild line with this d5 and then knight e2 and e4, and it leads to these positions that as a strong player are playable for both sides, but they're very dynamic. There's no straightforward plan, and it's just very hard to play at the beginner level. So when you go d5 here, you'll notice that white can develop the knight, like in the game, put a knight on c3, but it really doesn't do a whole lot here because you're over gripping the central square on e4. After knight e2, like in the game, and bishop to f5, again, white doesn't really have great grip in the center of the board because this pawn on d5 mirrors the pawn on d4. Now this is why I really like d5. The one way that white can aim for an imbalance is to play the move bishop takes f6. There's this famous grandmaster and current world #2 ranked player Hikaru Nakamura, who recently played in the Iowa State Championship. He played this move bishop takes f6. Of course, he was playing a much lower rated player in that game, but this is the one way that really strong players will try to create an imbalance. Now after bishop takes f6, what I would recommend is taking with the g pawn here. White will usually play a move like e3, and now you go for this move pawn to c5. If white chooses to play knight to f3 here, you can very quickly play knight c6. Let's say white goes c3, and after e5, very quickly you have this big black center here, and black is already quite a bit better, as you can see from the evaluation bar. Now you don't have to play it quite like this. You can even play something like e6 here, and after knight c2, knight c6, c3 here, for example, you can go bishop d6, bishop d3, and something like queen c7 with bishop d7 and castling queenside. But you'll notice that black has a really nice center with the pawns. Now, of course, another thing that people might have noticed is the bar was going a little bit higher for white, because the moves I was showing are not the absolute best moves, but at the beginner level, it's more about the concepts and the plans. Now when you get to a much higher level, like strong, intermediate, expert level, which is 2000 ranking, master level 2200, these are over the board ratings I'm referring to, not online rapid or blitz ratings, then you need to be very precise with the opening moves that you play, because if you do make a slight mistake, your opponent probably can punish them. But the purpose of these videos is aimed towards beginner and lower intermediate players, so I'm giving a lot of the concepts and plans versus trying to be super precise on the move orders. Now white can, of course, after c5, play the move pawn takes pawn here, and now you should play the move pawn to e6, creating the chain of the 3 pawns guarding each other. Not e5, by the way, because now after the move queen to f3 takes, knight c3, bishop e6, and castles, very quickly there's all kinds of pressure on the central pawn, and as you guys can see from the evaluation bar, white is in fact completely winning. So you should play e6 to protect this pawn while attacking this pawn, whereas with e5 you attack this pawn, but you create this very massive weakness on d5. So you should play e6 here. Normally your opponent will play something like knight f3, and again, it's very simple. You aim to develop your knight, your bishop, and your queen here. If white plays a move like c4, you're more than happy to go into an end game here, something like b6, castles, bishop b7, and then knight d7 here. And with the 2 bishops, there's a lot of play left in the position. I'm not going to go into the specific lines, but black should have a reasonable position where you can just play chess, and that's what we aim for in these videos. So if your opponent doesn't take on f6, we get knight d2 like in the game. I bring the bishop out, we get c3, e6, I go bishop e7, bishop d6, also completely fine, but I'm a little bit worried about this pin. So you know, say you get knight f3, or let's say white goes f3, for example. If I'm not careful and I castle after e4 takes, if I take, spaghetti time, I lose the queen. If I move the bishop after e5, suddenly the pin plays, and if I move the knight, I lose the queen again. If I move the bishop, I lose the knight, and with it I lose the game. So that's why I put the bishop on e7 to avoid any of this weird stuff like e4. After takes, suddenly takes, I just take back, takes, and black is up a pawn in this position. So you get knight f3, knight h4. Probably here, if I was following the themes, I should have played h6 to force the bishop away and then castle, because now after knight to h4, I can retreat the bishop to h7. Now, for anybody who's playing at an intermediate level, you will, of course, immediately recognize that the setup is very similar to a London system, this concept. But for those of you guys who are very new to the game and are unaware, after the moves d4, knight f6, white can play bishop f4, just to set up a random position here. Generally, when you get a position, let's just say like this, you want to play h3 here, so if black ever goes knight h5, trying to remove the bishop, you can drop this bishop back to h2. If you were to play a move like bishop d3, black can go knight to h5 here and eliminate this powerful bishop on the diagonal. So now back to the game. When we get this position here, right here, if I play h6, it's the exact same thing. Reverse pawn structure, bishop on the diagonal, so that I can drop the bishop backwards. All right, so I didn't do that. I allowed knight h4. We got bishop e2, we got g3, we got takes, and the one thing that I've mentioned that probably a lot of people did not pick up on is this idea of capturing towards the center. Now the center very specifically is referring to the E file and the D file here. That's why if, for example, white gets a move like pawn to e4, just to illustrate the point, this is what's known as the big white center, because it's all about the E and the D files. So if you get these pawns, it's the big white center. If black gets e5, this is the big black center. But these two files, the E and the D file, this is considered the center of the board. So when we get this position after takes and I recapture, if I play f takes, what I'm doing here is I'm capturing away towards this edge of the board. Very specifically, the H and the A files are referred as the edges because obviously they're the last files on the board. So when I capture this way, I'm capturing towards the edge of the board. And generally in chess, when you're going to get pawns stacked on top of each other, you want to capture towards the center. So when I capture this way, it's capturing towards these two files. Whereas when I capture this way, it's capturing towards the edge of the board. And I wouldn't say it's 100% universal, but at beginner level, always look to capture towards the center when you're going to get pawns stacked versus away from the center. Just keep that in mind if you're going to get pawns on top of each other. So back to the game, I take, we got h4, I go knight e4 here. Very important, because if I play with like rook c8, now after h5, let's say takes, all of a sudden white is attacking with the 2 pieces and black is in a lot of trouble. So I play knight to e4 here. We got all the trades, and now if white goes h5, I can simply play g5, and after h6 g6, this rook is going nowhere on this file. You have this pawn, which isn't necessarily that bad, but you'll notice that the rook is behind this pawn and my king is snug as a bug in a rug. I'm free to bring my rooks to the center of the board, and white has no way to attack this king because this pawn is simply in the way. All right, so we get d5 here. This was a bad move, I believe, because here this pawn restricts the knight, whereas after d5, suddenly the knight is loose. It's free to start jumping to all these squares, and as you can tell from the valuation bar, white is already in a lot of trouble. Now we get f4 here, which is a bad move. Just to give you guys a sample line, after takes, queen c2, and f5, for example, white is in a lot of trouble here, because if you try to castle queenside, which is a logical way to castle, you hang the pawn on a2. You play a move like b3 first to stop this threat of capturing a pawn. Then I go rook d8, and now the king cannot castle to the queen side either. And by pushing these pawns on the king side here to g3 and h4, you don't really want to castle king side, because after a move like c4 here, let's say rook d1 and knight d3, you've got this great knight in the center of the board, and at some point black is going to start pushing on the king side here to attack this white king. I don't have a set line for how to attack, but let's say you got something like this, king g2, something like queen f6. Let's say white goes rook h1 here. Now after a move like g5, actually g5 here is bad, so you can't quite do it. Maybe you should play rook b8. I don't have a concrete reason to explain why black is better here, but in the long run there should be a way to break through on the king side and have an advantage. So we got f4. That's a mistake. I play rook d8 here. Now there's the problem of the pawn and the bishop. If white moves the bishop after takes, now I think there's a knight to c4 here, and suddenly everything is weak, everything is collapsing in the center of the board, and white has 1 2 3 4 pieces underdeveloped. So you get e4, I take, now we get takes. This just loses the game. If white goes queen e2, I can simply take, and with 2 extra pawns here in the center of the board, after queen e3 and rook d3 with rook d8, all roads lead to a black victory. So we got takes, knight e5, and there isn't really a whole lot to explain here. We reach an endgame and I convert. So let's get going with our next game, our second game of the session with the white pieces, and let's get back to basics with e4. Now, as I've said many times, e4 and d4 both completely playable. We'll play d4. And now I'm going to go for this exchange variation. It's very easy to play because you put the bishop on the diagonal. You want to create the chain of 3, and you do this pretty much no matter what your opponent plays. Now, beyond the chain of 3, you have to figure out what else to do. c3, of course, guards the pawn. So I create the chain of 3. I have this great bishop. And when you play the exchange, generally you're looking to put this bishop on f4, so you have these 2 bishops on these great diagonals. I do believe people like Levy have mentioned queen c7 here to stop bishop f4 for black. I could be wrong on that. So you're almost always looking to put the bishop on f4 unless black puts the queen on c7. Here we got knight f6, so we'll develop the bishop. And now we simply want to develop the knights and castle the king out of the center. I don't know if I've mentioned this in previous videos, but full disclosure, this is actually the main system that I played against the Caro Khan as a kid, probably up until I was master level, maybe even close to international master level. So I definitely do approve of this variation. So we're gonna go knight f3 here. I could have played knight d2 as well. I'm looking to castle here, finish the development, bring the knight to the center. We will simply trade the bishops. We'll castle the king. We'll go rook to e1, and the main reason for rook to e1 here is that there are some shades of the London system, because when I go rook e1, I'm looking to play f4, bring all these pieces over to the king side, because I have this really awesome bishop on this diagonal. It's protected by the chain of 3. Note, black can't go knight before to hit the bishop. All these pawns ensure this bishop is a free diagonal. So I'm looking to play f4, rook e3, rook h3. This was also a very famous system played by, I believe, Jose Raul Capablanca, a former world champion, as well as Robert James Fisher. Now we get knight to d7. This actually is a blunder that loses on the spot, because I can go for this great gift. I take, and with the knight and the queen coming to the king side immediately, out of nowhere, it's spaghetti-o time. We're going to do a little bit of a yo-yo here. After king h8, I was expecting king h7 actually, so that this wouldn't be a check. King h7, I would have gone check and then recaptured with the check. So let's go, actually, you know what, let's go check anyway. Let's tickle the king. Let's take the rook. The king can move, the knight can block, queen can block. We get king h7, and now I'm just going to go rook to e3, lifting the rook and intending to immediately checkmate the black king. There are no squares available. this is simply GG. Now this game went by very, very quickly. So let's get back to the analysis board. We got this all very standard here. When you go bishop d3, almost no matter what black does here, after knight f6 for example, you go c3. After knight c6 you go c3. I think even after queen c7 you should probably play c. Maybe queen c7 is inaccurate because of knight c3, but even here c3 is completely fine as well. So pretty much you put the bishop on d3. If black were to take with the queen, by the way, you can simply play the move c4, queen d8, knight c3, and after knight f6, knight f3, let's say bishop g4, bishop e2, you castle, put this bishop on e3, and then play a move like queen b3, bring the rooks to the center, hit the pawn on b7, and white should be better. Now, anybody who's watched a video or has looked at a course on the Carcon, they're always going to capture the pawn. So you almost always reach this position with c3, and now black has some choices. Now queen c7 is a move to stop bishop to f4 here. Generally there are many ways for white to play. The way that I played growing up was knight to e2 here to force bishop f4, since knight will guard this bishop on the critical square. Nowadays I think after e5 it's considered to be very marginally better for white, with play for both sides I should say. Knight to a3 is also a move that's playable. I believe h3 is also a move. But when I was growing up, I played knight to e2 with bishop f4. Now let's say black goes to e5. After takes, check, block, takes, and castles, knight f6 and bishop g5. Probably balanced position after bishop to e7, but you reach a middle game with play for both sides. Now, if my goal were to show you guys or show a strong intermediate player how to try to fight for the advantage the best way, I do believe the most aggressive approach here is to play this move pawn to h3, but this is not a chessable course, nor is it intended for international master grand masters, so I won't really recommend h3. I would recommend playing knight to e2, just because once again you angle for this bishop f4 idea like you're going to play in pretty much every other variation within this exchange Caro-Kan. So you get knight f6, I put the bishop out, we get e6, knight f3, we get the trade. Now I go rook to e1, and here I play knight e5. Now I mentioned the London system once again for a second time, and that's because when we look at this position, it's very, very similar. In fact, you can reach this from the London system itself. So if we go to this position, after d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, c5, c3, knight c6, bishop d3 here. If black takes, after e takes d4, you'll notice that somehow out of the blue we have reached a direct transposition. I have both these bishops on the diagonals, and just to ensure that this is the same position, I'll go back to the game here. Let's go back here. This is the game. So you can reach this exact position out of London, but the other point that I want to make besides the direct transposition is that in the London system, very, very oftentimes, let me find the sideline I had here. Very oftentimes what you're aiming for is something like knight f3, knight d2, and at some point you look to play a move like knight to e5 here. I guess a better example of this would be what would be a better example? Better example would be something like this: bishop d6, takes, knight e5, castles, bishop d3. And after knight c6 you play this move f4 here, creating this great structure of the pawns here. If black ever takes, you fork the queen and the knight. And if black plays bishop d7, knight d2, let's say rook c8, castles, you look to play rook f3, rook h3, maybe even a queen h5 down the road with this great bishop, rook, and queen attacking on this diagonal for this light square bishop. So back to the game. We get this position. We trade. Rook e1. I play knight to e5. Again, if black takes, I take back, forking the queen and the knight. And now after knight d7, the game ends. But let's say black were to play bishop d7. I would probably play knight to d2 here. Let's say rook c8, and now I would go f4 here with the same sort of ideas of rook e3, rook h3, queen h5. You know, just to show a sample line, you get something like this, for example, rook h3, king g7, and now you can go knight f3 here. There's knight g5 to hit all the pawns. There's even queen to e1 and queen h4, and all roads here should be leading to a big advantage for white. It's not like it's winning on the spot, but it's very, very tough for black to play in this position. And also you'll notice the light square bishop here, very, very passive. It's walled in by all these pieces, whereas my light square bishop is awesome on this d3 square, hitting multiple diagonals. So we got knight d7. This is an error that loses immediately because after I take, we get takes. If king to f8 is played here, probably I would simply go queen to h5, threatening mate, and after takes queen c7, just dropping the bishop back. There's queen to h8. I can also bring the knight here to the king side, and white should win the game in due time. We get takes, check, takes, king h8, I check, and now I take. I was expecting king to h7 here, so that takes would not be a check, but it's irrelevant because I can still tickle the king, and then I get the check anyway. So we get this, I check, take, and now I go rook e3, and at this point with checkmate on the horizon, there's simply nothing that black can do to stop it. So we get a win in the second game. So here we go. We're going to play one more game and off we go. Now in this game, we once again get the black pieces. We get knight to f3, and here I'm going to play the move knight to f6. We get knight c3. Now my opponent's playing an unusual setup by bringing out these knights immediately here. I think I'm just going to play this move. I can play d5 or c5. I think I'm going to go for the move c5 here, because normally my feel is that when an opponent brings out the knights, they aren't going to want to play a Sicilian, but sure enough, we get a transposition to a Sicilian. So we get bishop c4. I'm going to play e6 here to stop any threats on the diagonal with the idea of bishop to e7 and finishing the development on the king side. Now that I've finished development on the king side, let's try to figure out where these pieces belong. Now the knight is probably the most important piece when you reach a Sicilian. It can go to either of these two squares here. When I look at this position, normally when you put a knight on d7, it's to reinforce the knight on f6, but also because usually in the Sicilian you have these pawns traded, so the knight can go to maybe like c5 to hit this pawn on e4. I'll show this with a specific example after the game ends, but in this case, if I put the knight here on d7, it supports the knight but doesn't do much else. So I'm going to go knight c6 here, trying to cover these two squares instead. Get a4. I guess I'll play a6 at some point. I probably want to play for b5 down the road. This move isn't necessary per se, but I want to go rook b8 and b5 later on. So let's go rook b8. And now we got this move a5. Now this move is simply a blunder. My queen and knight are guarding, so I just take. Queen guards the knight. White can't recapture. My opponent just blunders a pawn pretty much inexplicably and for no reason. Now I'm a little bit surprised by this move, because this is one of the things that's important as you're trying to improve at chess is, you know, you can have your opening strategy, but once you get to a certain level, you have to understand what the themes are in the middle game. And my opponent plays very logically here, developing the bishops, castles, puts the rook in the center. But now when we reach the middle game, because it's a closed position, my opponent simply doesn't have a concept or an idea in mind. And this is one of the things that I try to stress a lot, is that when you're trying to improve, you're trying to get better, you need to understand the themes and the ideas, because the openings are only going to get you so far. You're going to reach positions where your opponent doesn't blunder a piece or checkmate from the get-go. So we get h3. I'm going to trade the knight for the bishop. I am ahead in material here. I have one extra pawn. So let's go b5 here. We'll probably get the trade. My rook guards this pawn from being captured. We have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 1 2 3 4 5 6. So we're up by one pawn at this point in the game. We get to move rook a7. Excellent move for my opponent here, trying to pressure this bishop, trying to take advantage of the pin and the pressure potentially on this d file as well. So I'm going to go b4, attacking the pony. Reason I'm going to play this move is I could have played rook b7, but after the trade I would hang this pawn. So when I kick the knight away from c3, as you're about to see in a second when the knight moves, yeah, so the knight moves to e2. I'm going to play rook b7. Now if the rooks are traded, there's not going to be a knight takes pawn, because I push this pawn one square up the board. Get rook to a8. Now let's calculate. This pawn is free. The queen guards the bishop, the rook guards the bishop. So if I take, if takes, I'm fine. If takes, I'm simply guarding the bishop here. So now I'm up 2 pawns. I have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 1 2 3 4 5, 2 extra pawns here. I'm going to drop the knight back. And one of the things you want to keep in mind is when you're up in material, the main thing you need to make sure is that you're not losing the game immediately. So there's no big tactic where my opponent can punish me, which means that if there's no quick tactic or no quick attack, you should be able to consolidate your pieces, just bring the pieces back, and eventually the extra material will play a decisive role in the game. So like knight f6, very, very passive kind of move, but because I'm ahead in material, all I know that I need to do here is make sure I don't make any obvious blunders and then force some trades, and the extra 2 pawns will help me win the game. So let's go bishop b7. I don't mind the trade here. Now my knight protects the king, the rook guards the pawn, bishop is active. I spent a couple of moves there being very passive, but because I'm ahead in material, I can afford to do that. Whereas in materials, even sometimes you can't quite play like that, or if you're the one down in material, obviously you have to try and force the action a little bit more as well. We get the trade. I'll take with the queen here. Now I have 1 2 3 4 5 6. My opponent has 1 2 3 4, 2 extra pawns. My pawns guard each other in the center here. My queen and rook guard this pawn guards this one. So now it's simply a matter of trading down the material, or in the long run maybe even pushing the pawns to create some passers. We'll see what my opponent chooses to do here. Okay, now I'm normally I probably wouldn't make this trade, but I want to highlight the example here. So I'm gonna trade. I'm gonna claim this open lane here. I have 2 extra pawns at this point. The one issue, of course, is my king. So I probably want to go h6 to create the square and avoid the classic ice rank, or the ice rank, the back rank checkmate, I should say. We get queen to c6. Okay, I'm gonna go h6 here to create the square for the king. My queen still guards the pawns. Now I'm going to go back here, guard this pawn. I was a little bit imprecise with my play here, trying to force a concept. Not the best way of playing this, but I'm still up 2 pawns here in the center of the board, and I should be doing quite well, though my opponent has a little tricky move here. My opponent could have played knight to h5 to try to overload this pony on f6 potentially, but we get g4. Now I'm going to go queen to d8, protect the rook and the pawn. I'm going to look to push this pawn, open up the center of the board if I can. So we get king g2. I am going to play, I'm going to play d5 anyway. I'm just going to try to open up the board here. King is on a very suspicious diagonal as well, so let's trade. I will take back. Again, with 2 extra pawns, I'm more than happy to trade all the pieces off the board. Okay, and now we both have pawns here, but I have these 2 central pawns. So just to make sure I don't blunder, I'm gonna go c4. Just keep pushing the p, keep pushing the p. Go here. If takes, I push the p through. We get a queen and we win the game. Now I'm just going to mop this up very quickly. Okay, my opponent chooses to resign instead of playing it out. So let's get right into the analysis. Now we got knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and the reason that I played c5 here is that normally I feel like if my opponent's looking to play e4, they'll play it on move number 1. Generally, when you see these weird knight moves, my sense is that people want things like d5, d4, and something like a Torre or a London, or maybe a Jabava London. Generally, I don't feel like someone who wants to play e4 systems on move 1 is going to bring the knights out like this, and that's the exact reason that I played c5 here. We got e4, d6, transposing into a Sicilian. Now, the normal way you reach the Sicilian would be after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, knight c3, and knight to f6. All right, so back to the game. You have bishop c4. I play e6 here. Of course, after bishop c4, you can go a6 and b5. You can also play g6 and bishop g7, but I played e6 because I just don't want to deal with any threats on this diagonal. So I close the door on the bishop. We get castles. Now we get d3. Now, point that I'm going to show right here is if white plays d4 and we get some position like, let's just say a3, a6, and bishop g5. In these sorts of positions, sometimes you do want to put the knight on d7 here so that you can bring this knight to c5 to attack this pawn on e4 with these knights, or something like rook e1. Of course, ignore the evaluation bar, you guys, because obviously I'm not making the best moves. You can get a position like this where there's a lot, the knights support each other. There are threats like rook takes c3. There's also knight c5 here. The knight on d7 is very well placed when you guard the knight and you have access to the c5 square. But in the game, when we go forward here, if I put the knight on d7, there's nothing wrong. It guards the knight, but you'll notice there's no square really to target. White hasn't played d4, so I don't have the square. So knight on d7 is fine here. But I really feel like it's only guarding this knight, and when I put this knight on c6, it guards potentially the e5 square, but also now if white tries to play d4, at some point there's going to be some chaos here in the middle of the board. I feel like there might even be a queen b6 to put pressure on the knight and the pawn here, whereas with the knight on d7, white can maybe go d4 later, but white can also just ignore it and play something like queen e2, rook d1, rook e1, and later on play d4. And I just felt like the knight was better placed on c6 to keep an eye on the center square of d4. So we get a4, a6, we get rook e1, rook b8 here, and now we get the big blunder of the game, a5, or I should say minor blunder here. White struggles to come up with a concept, and this is one of the things here. It's not so easy to play for white because there are no open files. It's all about pawn breaks, and this actually reminds me of another opening, which is the Gucci piano. And the problem that I have with the Gucci piano at the beginner level is if you play the traditional one, just to illustrate the point, let's say castles, something like c3, d6 here, rook e1, h6, h3, rook e8. You'll notice it's a very closed position, and white either has to break with d4 or b4 in these type of positions. And generally, pawn breaks are the last thing you want to be thinking about as a beginner. This is very much an intermediate level into the advanced level thing, understanding when you're trying to play for pawn breaks. Like white maybe goes d4 here, or there's a moment when black should play d5. But understanding pawn breaks is probably something that a beginner and even intermediate level, I think, is something that's very tough to really utilize in any kind of way that makes sense. So that's why I don't like these closed positions very often. It's why I don't recommend the Gucci piano, and it's also why I think if you're going to play a Sicilian, generally you want to play a regular Sicilian from the get-go, because then you get the open files and the diagonals, and very rarely is it about pawn breaks. Like here, there's no pawn breaks. You just bring the pieces out, you develop very normally, and the pawn break theme isn't really existent per se. So back to the game. Where were we? We're already here. Here my opponent struggles to come up with a plan. Probably the computer likes d4 the most. Rook e1, h6, bishop h4, and probably something like rook b8. Again, you should play d4. Best idea. I think it's just hard to play this from the white side, so that's I don't really have any great concepts or themes. Even where I'm at, you just have to play moves. There isn't a clear-cut idea, which is why I don't like this opening approach from my opponent. But we got the move a5. This hangs a pawn because the queen simply guards the knight from capture. We got h3, takes, b5, takes, and now I played the move b4. Now I considered playing rook b7, but after takes, there's the move knight takes b5 here. I guess knight takes e4 is actually good enough, so I could have done it, but I simply didn't want to hang the pawn, so I kicked the horse away, played rook b7. Now after takes, the pawn of course is not hanging as the knight has been removed. Get rook e8, I take, takes, knight f4, knight f6, and now we get the move c4. Now the point about this position is knight f6 is a little bit timid. I'm going backwards, but because I have the extra pawns, all that I really want to do is trade off all the pieces. Because I have these 2 extra pawns on the board, as long as I'm not getting attacked, as long as there's no tactic, I can take my dilly-dally old time and sort of figure out what sort of piece setup I want because of the extra material, and eventually the extra material will be decisive. So I played rook d7, we get c4, the trade, queen d3, I take here. In a normal game, I would probably just go e5, attacking the knight. If white takes, this knight guards the rook. If white moves the knight, I trade and go e4, forking the queen and the knight. And after takes, and rook c7, I'm just aiming to push p. With a rook for a knight, I should win the game. So I decided to trade down. I played rook a7. We get this position where I'm a little bit imprecise here. White could have played knight h5, attacking the knight. If I take, I lose the rook. And after queen e7, takes, black still probably is doing very well with the two extra pawns, but I do have double pawns, and these pawns on d6 and c5 are under severe pressure here, combined with an open file, so it's going to require quite a bit of technique to emerge victorious. Instead, we get g4. I go here, d5, takes. Now my opponent simply trades into an endgame where we have the same number of pawns on the king side, but I have 2 connected passed pawns, so I simply push the p. I go d4. If white does not take this pawn on d4 and plays f4, I can just bring my king ever closer, walk it up, collect all the juices on the king side. And if white can't take either pawn here, you can't take this one because it's guarded by the pawn. And if you capture this one, then the pawn gets through. So my opponent took, I pushed the p, made a queen, and my opponent resigned the game. So that is our 3rd game for this educational speedrun video. We emerged victorious in all 3. I actually am pretty happy with these games. I felt there were better themes than the last video I did. But that's going to do it for our latest edition of our educational speedrun series. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more educational speedrun videos, recaps, and everything else in the very near future. So I hope you guys enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day. See you soon. Bye.